Hello, hello, and welcome back to Organic Gardening for Beginners. Today we are taking two topics that might not seem like they go together, which is military life and gardening. And the reason why is because tomorrow is Veterans Day, November 11th, 2023. Today's the 10th. I'm recording this one day in advance so that I can schedule it to be ready for you in the morning time. And the reason why I'm putting these together and why I'm mentioning Veterans Day is because my husband just retired from a 20-year career in the U.S. Marine Corps. Now, I met him when he was about halfway through at 10 years. So I am with him through the second half of his career. And gardening was not something I was going to leave behind, even knowing that we would have duty stations and moves and deployments and all the things coming up for that second 10 years of his career. And so today, why I'm bringing this up is because I want to help give you some ideas of how you can get started with gardening, even if you are traveling around as the military spouse or as the active duty service member, and how it might help kind of find something grounding, something to connect with others with, something to focus on, especially if you are having a tough time being the spouse that is kind of left behind while your person is out doing trainings, deployments, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to try not to say spouse 1,000 times throughout this episode. It might be tricky, so we'll sub in person this time. And so anyways, I just want to share my experience with you, some tips with you that I've picked up along the way, and some celebration. Military life is something super special, but also something super hard. So if you can find something to make it a little bit easier or joyful or community-based for you, then awesome. You need it. So now, without further ado, because that was a longer intro than I normally do, let's jump into the actual tips, advice, strategies, all that good stuff that I have got going for you today, which is why bother gardening? You know that you're going to be on the move. You know that you're going to have to leave your garden behind. You know that you're going to have to start over with every single move. So why bother? And a garden is worth it, so worth it to me, no matter your circumstance. You know, whether you're a college kid listening to this, whether you are a retired person listening to this, whether you're a stay-at-home mom listening to this, a garden always helps, in my experience. You know, obviously everything today is going to come through my lens of perspective, my lens of experience. So the big reasons that I believe a garden can help so much if you're in this situation is it's a skill that travels with you no matter what. No matter when you start your garden, whether it's pre-military life, you know, in it, after it, whatever, it's something a skill that you can hone and take with you no matter where you live, no matter what your circumstances are. And that skill can be anything from, hey, I can grow some of my own food, or I can grow these beautiful flowers that make me happy or make somebody else happy. It can be a skill of leaving behind a better earth than what you inherited. Or, you know, hey, it's a skill of I fed the pollinators. There was nothing there before. Now there are a bunch of flowers. I know that the hummingbirds and the bees and the butterflies all found some food a little more easily because I planted that garden. So that skill doesn't expire. It's nothing you leave behind. And I find a huge amount of satisfaction in that. It is also a project to tackle after your new move to get you grounded. And I mentioned that word before. It kind of establishes you where you are at and where you are going to be calling home for, you know, some amount of time. And I think that there's kind of a ritual to that. You know, think of moving into a new place and you paint the walls, or you buy new furniture or whatever it is to kind of help you settle into that space. And gardening for me was always that of we're in a new house, we were never in an apartment, but we rented and we bought houses during these 10 years. And no, even if it was just a rental, we still put in a garden. It also gives some routine. And this can be really important for you if you have kids, or if your spouse is out on deployment or gone often for trainings and whatnot, then having that garden as a routine, a regular chore that you're getting outside and working on it, that for me was really helpful, especially once I had kids. And kind of related to that, having a garden while you are involved in military life, it gets you outside. It gets you chatting with the neighbors, especially when you live on base, or if you are renting or you've bought a house out in a residential area, then it's a really nice way to meet your neighbors. Maybe you can get some plants from them. Maybe you share some plants with them once your garden gets established. If you guys are both outside, you're more likely to make friends, have a good relationship, all those normal neighborly things that can be really tricky to do when you are always moving and constantly having new neighbors. And I'm going to mention gardening on base in a minute because I know that that might be something that pops into your head of, I live on base, how can I make this work? And then the last two ways that gardening really helped me as a military spouse was it gave me something of my own to work on when my husband was gone. And as I've mentioned before on this episode and in other episodes, I started gardening long before I met him when I was 12. So even if I had married a non-military person, I still would have gardened, of course. But it became particularly helpful and almost therapeutic when he was gone because it gave me a goal, something to work on that I wanted to have it look nice, be productive, be in good shape when he came back from months gone or weeks gone or a super busy time at work when I was kind of holding down the fort at home. And so having this project that has all the other benefits, of course, that I already mentioned of growing food, growing flowers, meeting people, it becomes this big project for yourself that you kind of take ownership of while you're in this lifestyle. I kind of threw those two together into the same one, but basically the last one was it motivates you, or motivated me, to grow the best garden I could to show my husband when he got back from those longer deployments. If he was gone for 6 months, of the growing season, then when he came back, of course I wanted the garden to look awesome and show all these things that I'd been working on while he was gone. So aside from just the fact that I've always loved gardening, those were the big ways that gardens helped me specifically during these past 10 years of our lives. And now I want to move on to some of the tips. If you have just listened to these and thought, okay, I see your point. Let's give this a shot. And if you're living on base, I'll start there. If you're living on base, you can totally have a garden still. Of course, it depends, base to base, what their rules are, how tightly enforced those rules are. That, of course, is going to affect what you can install. But if you, at the very least, get some containers, you can grow a very nice container garden. Almost all base housing that I saw had at least some sort of back porch or patio. We got lucky and we had a fenced-in backyard, and I built some raised beds in there, as well as, growing in containers on the patio and like around the side beds of the house. And as long as I kept them tidy and looking halfway decent, then the housing office didn't really care. Nobody ever came by and said, hey, you have to take out your plants. If you put in raised beds or you put your planters on the grass, just be aware that you might need to take them down in time before your move to reseed the grass so that you're not leaving behind a bunch of bare dirt and then getting dinged with a fine for that. So just a little context I want to throw in there to kind of plan ahead for. So another tip I've got for you, if you are wanting to start a garden as a military spouse, potentially living on base, maybe you're renting a house out in town, is realize that your climate is probably going to be different than what you came from. This happened to me multiple times because I grew up, as you guys know, in Washington State, where it's rainy. Summers are not that hot. We get plenty of rainfall. And so when we moved to Southern California originally, my first garden really suffered because I was not watering the way that I needed to in that particular climate. And I also started things on the schedule that I was used to, as far as planting your tomatoes in May. And, you can still plant peas in April, things like that. And the climate did not support that. And so the second year I watered way more and saw a drastic improvement in my garden. And then I also stepped up the schedule by a couple of months on almost everything. So I was putting my tomatoes out in March and planting my peas in February, because to plant things later just meant that it would get too hot before the plants were established, or things wouldn't produce at all. Like, I never honestly succeeded that well at growing things like snap peas because the climate was just too hot. And so you might need to acknowledge that that first year is not going to be as good as your previous year if you're in a different climate. It happened to us again when we moved to South Carolina. I was used to planting earlier to deal with the heat, but my goodness, the humidity there was insane. And so when I planted out my zinnias in the springtime, as per usual, before they even bloomed, they were covered in powdery mildew because of the humidity. And so again, the second year I learned from that and I planted earlier so that they could get more established before disease would take them out. This can also be something like if you're living on the East Coast, because there are a lot of military installations on the East Coast. If you're in Virginia or North Carolina or even in, say, like Texas, and you have hurricane activity, you can have some big windstorms that come through that you might not have experience with otherwise. And so think ahead to trellis things, to stake plants that you might not have otherwise, such as those zinnias. If they get tall enough and a big old rainstorm comes through, then they can get flattened down to the ground and not really recover. And so these take time to learn. Like you can ask at the nurseries and ask, hey, what should I plan for? What's the weather like? What are the seasons? But just like a great many things in life, you have to experience it yourself in order to really let that lesson sink in and change your gardening habits accordingly. If you're moving up, say to the Northeast, we were never stationed in the Northeast, but snow is going to be a bigger issue there. Heavy freezes, prolonged periods of frozen ground, and super cold weather. Those are all going to need acclimations and adaptations to your garden and your systems and your seed starting in a way that you will have to learn once you get out there. So just keep in mind, if you've gardened before, your first garden is probably going to suck, and that's okay. It just means that the second year it's going to be better, and you're going to have learned from how that climate is different than what you've experienced before. Now, I mentioned getting out to the nursery, and this is a really handy way to get those insider tips of, when does the freeze usually come? Or what do I need to watch out for in the summer? Are there pests that are super active in this area that, might not have been where you came from? For example, the squash vine borers that I had in South Carolina, I had never actually had a problem with those before. They're a big issue down there. So things will change, not just the weather and not just how your seasons ebb and flow, but also pests, diseases, things like that you might be able to get some words of wisdom from nurseries and growing centers and whatnot, and see what they can share to maybe ease that transition just a little bit. And then the last thing on this little adapting to your climate is grow local acclimated items when you can, just for fun. For example, when I was in California, I grew a ton of succulents and lots of hibiscus because they are adapted to the climate. They love it there, they thrive. And now that I'm back up in Oregon, I have neither of those. And it was a fun little opportunity to grow something that I might not normally. And while I was living in California and in South Carolina, I was complaining occasionally, I can't grow rhubarb, I can't grow blueberries, these crops that do really well here in Washington and Oregon that don't do well in the heat. And so I had to remind myself, yeah, you can grow blueberries when you get home, but for right now, enjoy the hibiscus that are bushes in South Carolina and would be this scrawny little sad thing in Oregon because it's just not hot enough. So if you are living on the East Coast, especially in the South, try sweet potatoes, try okra. Those are very adapted to the climate. They're commonly grown, so you can find them easily and get some good tips from people who grow them on the regular. And maybe let go of some of those things that did grow in your previous climate. Like I gave up trying to grow snap peas when I was in California. I did not grow them in South Carolina at all because they just didn't suit the weather. You could try growing peanuts instead because those suit the weather and the climate in the South. So be flexible. This all boils down to be flexible, realize things are going to change. If this is your first time growing in your new climate, then be extra flexible and realize it's not you, it's probably the climate and just getting used to somewhere other than where you've been living. Even if you weren't gardening, you kind of know the weather to expect when you're familiar with an area. Throw gardening on top of that and a new climate, and you're just going to have to take a little bit of time to kind of get your head on straight and figure out what you're doing. So be patient, be flexible, try some new things, and embrace your new climate rather than fight it. Two other things I want to bring up, some tips, are one is trade plants for services. This came in really handy when we were moving one time, where I gave my dog sitter all of my succulents, and I got free dog sitting for the few days where we had the movers and the packers in the house to pack and load the house, where it was just easier to not have the dogs underfoot. And so I gave her a ton of succulents, my dog sitter, and she took the dogs for a couple of days so that the house was empty. The packers could pack in peace. The movers could, be in and out without worrying about letting a dog out. You could do this for cleaning, especially if you're on base and you don't want to deal with any of the potential fees of not cleaning it to their specifications, because on-base housing can be very prickly when it comes to move-out cleans. Try trading your plants or your produce, kind of build up a backlog during the summertime if you're moving later in the year of, hey, I'll give you all this garden produce or these tomatoes or flowers or whatever. Can I trade you in a few months when we have to move for cleaning services, dog watching services, babysitting services? So that way you guys can both benefit from what each other has to offer. And then lastly, this one's a tough one, is be prepared to leave your garden. It sucks. I know. It is heartbreaking in a way. When I had to cut down all my flowers, the ones that wouldn't transplant well, for example, I had nasturtiums that were growing up our fence in the backyard that were too interwoven into the fencing to transplant it all. And so we had to cut them down, because otherwise, as I just mentioned, we would get a penalty fee from the housing office on base. I literally cried because my hummingbirds had been so active on those nasturtiums. I actually made my husband do it because I couldn't. He took the weed whacker to him, and I was in the house crying over the stupidity of not being able to leave behind these pretty flowers. And housing has their agenda, and I get it, and that's not the point of this episode. But you are going to have to leave your garden behind. And the effort, the time, the money that you put into it, it's just, I guess it's kind of a trade-off of the things that you get from it while you have your garden and those things that you are going to quote unquote lose when you leave it, that effort, time, and money that I just mentioned. But just enjoy it while you have it. Enjoy it while you're experiencing it, while you're watching those hummingbirds, and just kind of put it out of your mind that you are going to have to leave them behind, so that you can enjoy it in the moment. And you might inspire others. I heard from multiple people in my neighborhood that they were inspired to start a garden because they would always walk by our house and see my garden beds and see the flowers and see the butterflies. And it inspired them to start their own little garden while they were there. And that is totally worth it. If my garden, my chatting with them, my sharing of plants, if that can inspire one other family or one other person to start a garden and begin this lifelong habit, awesome. Totally worth it to me. And so just mentally prepare yourself, maybe go a little bit on the budget side of getting your garden going, because you're going to have to leave it behind. And I've actually, our next episode 31, is going to be about gardening while renting, because I've had plenty of gardens that I've had to leave and have started new ones over the years. And so I've got some good tips to share with you there. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I want to start a garden, but I don't want to invest a bunch of money and materials and whatnot, then hold tight. Next Tuesday, episode 31, you'll get it. But leaving your garden behind shouldn't be a reason to not start in the first place. That's what I'm trying to get at. So all told, there are a few things to keep in mind as far as being flexible, realizing that this is not a permanent garden, trying to adapt to your new climate. But all in all, it's so worth it. And I love knowing that the plants that I gave to my neighbors when we left our last duty station for this retirement, they're still growing. The hummingbirds found them, I'm sure. The butterflies found them, the bees, and they're all All my plants are now interspersed throughout my neighborhood to make it just a little bit more wildlife friendly, a little bit prettier, making the people who inherited the plants a little bit happier. And that is an awesome feeling to leave the military life with. So this felt like a little bit of a scattered episode, and that's partially me. I did actually have to pause this recording a couple of times because I was getting teary because the military was a huge part of my life for the last 10 years. Definitely affected my perspective on life, how I use my garden. Here I go getting teary. Sorry. Anyways, I'm going to wrap this up before I start crying on you guys. I just want to say, if you're in the service, thank you so, so much. It's a different perspective that you only get once you're in that lifestyle. If you are a spouse, thank you very much. It's a very tough job. My husband would always joke that being the spouse was the toughest job in the Corps. He was not the only one I heard make this joke, and there were days where I would say, you are absolutely right. And for the families of service members, the parents, the aunts, the uncles, the kids, the grandparents, the friends, thank you very much for your service as well. It does not go unnoticed by a lot of people. On that, I will leave you. We'll be back to our regular Tuesday episode. And thanks for hanging out with me on this episode for Veterans Day. Just wanted to share some thoughts with you and say thank you.